After the flurry of activity we had with the first look, first teaser, and first showrunner interview for Amazon's Lord of the Rings: The Rings of Power, it may have been easy to miss that there was a second Vanity Fair article published featuring a Q&A with showrunners Patrick McKay and J.D. Payne. The article, titled 10 Burning Questions About Amazon's The Rings of Power, actually had some really good questions that I've been asking a lot myself. And while I think there's still a couple things that worry my Tolkien fan heart, there's also some signs of encouragement as well. So we'll go through their 10 burning questions one by one, and I'll give my thoughts on their responses to each. Number 1, the look. First up, the showrunners were asked if this series will look like the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Now, it's important to know that for legal reasons, this show cannot wholly exist in the exact same continuity as the Peter Jackson films made by New Line and Warner Brothers. However, in McKay's words, it will be different but familiar. So while they can't say that this is a direct prequel, that doesn't mean it has to clash with the films we know and love. One example is this poster, which we now know to show Elendil and his sword, Narsil. It's obviously quite different design-wise from the sword we see in The Lord of the Rings. And this is because they couldn't legally use the design from the Warner Brothers owned films. However, on the flip side, they can play into some of the things we saw in Peter Jackson's adaptations. We'll get to some of those in a minute, but one example the article gives is the casting for Galadriel, Elrond, and Gil-galad. All three are characters we meet in The Lord of the Rings, and all three were cast to bear at least somewhat of a resemblance to their Peter Jackson counterparts. I was actually quite surprised how similar our new Gil-galad is to our old one. While not as robust a list as the upcoming War of the Rohirrim, Rings of Power does have a couple key people contributing to the look of the series that played a role in the previous films: legendary illustrator John Howe and costume designer Kate Hawley. Number 2, CGI. The second question brings up CGI use in the new series. In what has become quite a pleasant trend, Amazon has become another studio that says they're putting an emphasis on practical effects. While there will no doubt be a good number of digital effects, as there would be for any film or series with a decent budget, being able to mingle digital and practical effects was something the original trilogy did incredibly well. It is said outright in this article that while some of the stranger monsters may be digital, the orcs will be guys in suits and not computer generated. One big lesson we learned from the 6 Middle-earth films is how much more effective those practical orc suits can be. They even mentioned that they initially wanted to film Khazad-dûm scenes in caves under an actual mountain in New Zealand, and while it didn't work out due to space constraints, the fact that that was their first thought and that they then instead built practical sets is an approach I greatly appreciate. Number 3, the source material. Another big question we've been wondering about for years now is exactly what rights does Amazon have? Payne cleared that up, saying, "We have the rights solely to the Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, the Return of the King, the Appendices, and the Hobbit. And that's it. We do not have the rights to the Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, the History of Middle-earth, or any of those other books." As McKay points out, there's all kinds of references to the Second Age events sprinkled throughout the 4 books, so they aren't entirely flying blind here. There's all kinds of songs and tales told in The Lord of the Rings that call back to Gil-galad, Earendil, the Rings of Power, and others. Still, the idea of telling the story of the Second Age without access to Unfinished Tales or the final portion of the Silmarillion is certainly a daunting one. Now, this is a rumor I've heard and not stated in this article, but some have said that Amazon can ask for permission from the Tolkien estate on a case-by-case basis to include things from these other books. So there may yet be hope that we could see things that only appear in these tales. McKay also mentions that they are not allowed to egregiously contradict something they don't have the rights to, which is yet another comfort. Even if they don't have the rights to the Silmarillion, they still have to mostly adhere to the framework it sets. Payne also mentions that they worked in conjunction with world-renowned Tolkien scholars and the Tolkien estate to make sure the ways we connected the dots were Tolkienian and gelled with the experts and the estate's understanding of the material. First off, the fact that the Tolkien estate is involved beyond the sale of the rights is an encouraging thought. I've never bought into the idea that once the sad day came that Christopher Tolkien passed away, that the estate stopped caring about the legacy of Middle-earth. No doubt there are those in the estate more open to the idea of adaptations being made than Christopher might have been, but I just can't believe that people whose lives are so intertwined with this world would be content to just sell the rights and cast it into the void. As a side note, in case you haven't seen it yet, the Tolkien estate recently launched their new website, which has some terrific archival audio of the professor among other things that are wonderful to see, so I highly recommend checking it out. Personally, I'm very curious to find out who the Tolkien scholars are that Amazon is utilizing for the show. There's certainly no shortage of Tolkien scholars in the world, but there are very few at the same level as Tom Shippey, who we know was let go for what seemed like a pretty innocuous breach of NDA. Here's hoping the cost of losing Shippey doesn't prove greater than the show can bear. Number 4, the sound. Next up, the question was brought up, will the series sound like The Lord of the Rings? As we've heard before, Howard Shore is returning to work on the music for the series, so in terms of the score, I think it's safe to say it will sound like Middle-earth. In the article, author Joanna Robinson, who has seen the first 3 episodes, mentions their team found a mix of cleverly repurposed lines of Tolkien's dialogue, as well as a few snatches of biblical text. First, I loved hearing that there's cleverly repurposed dialogue. One of the greatest achievements of Peter, Fran, and Philippa, in my opinion, was how often, when they needed lines of dialogue, they pulled from other parts of the book. Using Tolkien to supplement Tolkien is a pretty great recipe for success. Whether it was giving some of Treebeard's lines to Galadriel to open the film, or giving a famous Tom Bombadil moment to Treebeard, the more Tolkien that can be squeezed into an adaptation, the better. All this to say, with the rights to all 4 books and the appendices, we could see more of Tolkien's words repurposed than we may have originally expected. They also mentioned finding biblical text within the dialogue of the show, which is also incredibly appropriate given Tolkien's Catholic faith pulses throughout the entirety of Tolkien's work. Aside from story threads and themes, you'll sometimes find direct Bible quotes in lines of dialogue. Now, I usually don't comment publicly here on the channel every time an article pops up claiming Tolkien's faith isn't woven into the story, but I'll just simply say that anyone who claims otherwise is likely baiting for clicks or woefully ignorant of the world, and many times it's both. Payne mentions that both showrunners have religious backgrounds in addition to his study of Hebrew poetry, parallelism, inverted parallelism, chiasmus, and the works of Shakespeare. They even go into how different races of Middle-earth will have different meters in which they speak, which is honestly way above my English literature background, but I'd highly recommend our friends Alan and Sean's recent Rings of Power wrap-up podcast episode, where they explain these in much better detail and clarity. So this all sounds good. Now we just have to hope that all of these result in characters who sound Tolkienian. Number 5, the feel. The next question posed to the showrunners was, will it feel like The Lord of the Rings? To their credit, the showrunners point out that Peter Jackson's trilogy nailed the tone they themselves are chasing. As they say, it's heartfelt but it's complex and political. It's dark and intense, but it's also whimsical and funny and sweet. It's very rare to find an author who, in any medium, tries to play every note on the piano. Sometimes it's suspenseful, sometimes it's scary, sometimes it's esoteric and complex and wildly imaginative. But it's all Middle-earth. Once again, I have to say this is an encouraging point for me. While I've often mentioned this when talking about the show's rating, which has been confirmed to be TV-14, I felt like Peter Jackson's trilogy absolutely nailed the balance of Tolkien's world. The fact that Payne and McKay have set their sights at the same target is great to hear. Number 6, Durin the Deathless. Next up, the question was posed, did Vanity Fair make an error in calling the Dwarven Prince Durin IV? And I have to say, I probably contributed to people thinking they had. In my video, I suggested it might be a typo. since Durin III is the one who receives a Ring of Power. All the article says here is that the dwarf we've seen is indeed Durin IV, and while it acknowledges that Durin III and Durin IV are not father and son in Tolkien's works, and that it simply isn't a name passed down, all the article states is that the show is compacting thousands of years into a single shortened timeline. And this idea remains one of my biggest areas of concern for the show. While I'm fully committed to giving the show every chance and will not be judging it prior to seeing it, my fear is that the compression of the timeline will come at a huge cost to the story, the characters, and the world. If Durin III and Durin IV are indeed father and son, it will be one of those things that just bugs the heck out of me. The article gives the excuse that they're condensing the timeline, which I took as an attempt to justify having two simultaneous Durins, but they're the ones condensing it, so it's kind of their fault, you know? I mean, just use any other dwarven name than Durin for one of these characters, and we're good. Make the emergence of a new Durin a significant storyline by all means, but don't cheapen the significance of Durin just because you chose to pack 3,000 years into 30. I'll likely make an entire video later about the compressed timeline, but I'm also very curious to see how this affects the tension between the elves and Numenor, and the speed of Sauron's rise, defeat, his fall, his rise again, and fall again. It's probably my biggest fear for the show, that the condensed timeline will come at too steep a price for the story. Number 7, Elf-Human Romance. No doubt you'll recall that in the original Vanity Fair first look, we were told there is a forbidden love between human woman Bronwyn and male elf Earendil. As I mentioned in my breakdown video on the article, this calls to mind the story of Galadriel's brother Aegnor and his love for the mortal woman Andreth. We are told here that this storyline will not dominate Season 1's plot, and is instead a way to engage with a story Tolkien himself found compelling, the idea of mortal-immortal pairings. I love that they too referenced Andreth and Aegnor, and hope that we'll get to see some of the more tragic effects of this sort of pairing. And hearing this will not dominate the show leads directly into the next point. And for number 8, I'll just go ahead and read the full question. This sounds like a lot of made-up story. What of Tolkien's can one expect? This question earns a hearty amen from me, as it was exactly my feelings after seeing the first look and the teaser. Nearly everything of substance we've seen or heard thus far has been things original to this show. While it may be enough to entice a casual audience with meteor men, ice trolls, and created romances, oops, sorry, wrong one, there we go. Those things certainly didn't give me the impression I was about to go on an adventure in Middle-earth. Which, I'll say it again, is fine. I fully acknowledge that I'm not the target audience for the promotional pieces that have been released thus far. That being said, McKay says here that they told Amazon they wanted to do 4 or 5 stories that are the big epics of the Second Age. Here they specify 4. The Forging of the Rings, The Rise of Sauron, The Fall of Numenor, and The Last Alliance of Elves and Men. They also say that Season 1 will be all about the heroes of Middle-earth, specifically saying they don't want to do a villain-centric thing. Personally, I really like that this isn't going to be a Sauron-centric show. It's amazing how often villains can be at their best when used sparingly. And in my opinion, we don't need some sympathetic version of Sauron. Give me the threat of Sauron throughout the show, and when he does appear, give me the conniving, manipulative, powerful Sauron in all his Second Age malice. We also get hints that we will indeed see main characters that line up with their film counterparts, even where they divert a bit from the text. For instance, they say part of Elrond's development will be from a hopeful young elf seeking to make alliances to the men are weak version we got in The Lord of the Rings. Likewise, Isildur is described as young and optimistic, which will eventually lead him to make a final tragic decision, as opposed to the mistake of a fool. I'm hopeful for this arc as I'd love to see Isildur the hero before he makes that fateful decision to take the ring. It would have been difficult to depict him otherwise, but the Peter Jackson films certainly make him a far less sympathetic and tragic character than he truly is. As I've said before, a good prequel enhances the viewing of the original, and this could be one of the best chances for this show to do that. The article also mentions the mystery of a younger Sauron in his more seductive phase, and calling him canonically hot. It's worth noting this is the article and not the showrunner's words. And this is a different topic for a different day. Number 9, Warrior Galadriel. The next topic covered is the version of Galadriel we've seen in the teaser and images so far. As I mentioned in my earlier video, one of my fears for this show was that it would turn Galadriel into simply another warrior princess type, without any of the defining traits Tolkien gave her. And it sounds like by the end of this show, she will become the ethereal leader we know from The Lord of the Rings. We know from the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales that Galadriel had a deep desire to go to Middle-earth and rule a kingdom of her own. And considering Galadriel's one of my favorite characters, I certainly don't mind her getting a larger focus in this story. Like I've said before, I just hope the changes to her role don't come at the cost of characters we know a lot about among the elves, like Elrond and Gil-galad, or even at the cost of Galadriel herself. There's certainly room for all to have their proper due in an ensemble adaptation. In the article it says, "What's more important than Galadriel's armor and weaponry is the turmoil of emotions we see raging inside her, having already survived multiple attacks by Sauron and his predecessor Morgoth, and losing her brothers in the process. This gives me some hope that we could see a more complex Galadriel than just a generic warrior princess. In the Second Age, Galadriel is one who has lost her 3 brothers, still desires to rule a kingdom, and can justifiably be adapted as more ambitious than we might otherwise assume. Book fans will know that for a long time, Galadriel is teeming with pridefulness. I think it's safe to say liberties will be taken. The real test will be if this still feels like Galadriel. I'll be very curious to see how she progresses, to the point where, by the end of the show, she's moved beyond armor and weaponry and become the Galadriel we know from the Third Age. Number 10, Wizards. The topic of Meteor Man comes up at the end of this article, and his attire in the poster and the final shot of the teaser certainly call to mind that of Gandalf from the films. When asked if this could be Gandalf, Radagast, or Saruman, McKay answered, "Well, I would say those are not the only beings, those names, in that class. So maybe, but maybe not. And the mystery and the journey of it is all of the fun, I would say." This certainly sounds like it is in line with my initial guess that this would be one of the Blue Wizards, but I can't help but think this comment is a red herring by McKay here. I'm still not sure what to think of this whole meteor thing. Part of me thinks the whole thing could be an illusion created by Sauron to make it seem like he, or whoever this person is sent by Eru himself, or at least the Valar. We know from the story of Gorlim in the First Age that Sauron is capable of making people see things that aren't there. Gorlim sees his wife, Eilunel, which leads to his capture. Only then does Sauron reveal that Eilunel is long dead, and that it was merely an illusion of Sauron's creation. The final question Vanity Fair poses is, should fans be worried? The article acknowledges that fans will always be worried. Personally, while I've always said and remained committed to not judging the show until I've seen it, I worry about it all the time. I worry that they'll get characters like Galadriel, Elrond, Gil-galad, Elendil, and Isildur wrong. I worry that they'll lean into this idea of hot Sauron and take his description of being seductive in entirely inappropriate directions. I worry that the vast condensing of the timeline will rob the dwarves of one of their most distinctive attributes, and come at the cost of the driving force of the entire Second Age, the immortality of the elves, the mortality of men, and the slow decay of the world itself. This will be the dance we do as Tolkien fans for the next several months, navigating the balance of encouraging and worrying bits of info here and there, all while hoping for the best. One day we will learn that created character Halbrand's name means hidden noble, leading us through a list of intriguing options of which Tolkien character this secretly is. The next thing we get is a hobbit name like Elenor Nori Brandyfoot, which sounds like it came from throwing darts at a Tolkien name board. And super Tolkien nerds can tell you at least 3 reasons why this name doesn't make any sense. I'm very curious to see how the pendulum will swing over the coming months. The article concludes with the oft-quoted Tolkien letter 131, where Tolkien mentions leaving room for other minds and hands wielding paint and music and drama. I, for one, am glad we're getting more Tolkien adaptations. It's exciting, it's nerve-wracking, it's fun. But I hope that Payne, McKay, and company truly realize the stewardship they say they've been given. While Tolkien may have left room for others to wield paint and music and drama, Tolkien is the standard by which all adaptations will be judged. Adapting Middle-earth is not for the faint of heart. Will Payne, McKay, and their team be up to the task? We'll find out this September. Let me know in the comments what you think after reading this Q&A. Are you feeling more optimistic, pessimistic, or pretty much the same? As always, I want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil 19, Listen Me the Cinda, Mandu Pandu, Andrew Carlisle, The Mighty Mim, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Salim Rahman, Zetrock, Berto Berg, Grand Strategy Nerd, Graham Darricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Michael Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description and purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching and subscribing, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.